Our project investigates the relationship between the Surrealist art movement of the 1920s and surreal video games today. Today, surreal is a commonplace term, particularly amongst video games in the indie space. Under user-defined tags and developer-defined terms, surreal games like 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿𝗰𝘁, Nubby's Number Factory, and Out of Hands are increasingly prevalent. Yet the term surreal is usually used to describe an aesthetic, a vague substitute for weird and unusual. The relationship between such games and the idea of surrealism is unclear, such as how, if at all, the principles of the original surrealist movement shaped surreal video games, or how surrealism, steeped as it is in the irrational, might reconcile with a logic-based medium like video games. So we asked, how might surrealist philosophy be used to design a video game? What kind of game might be created from a surrealist production process? And why do these questions matter? Surrealist artwork is about subconscious expression, a kind of bearing of the soul. As with all art, it presents a certain perspective on the world, but surrealism's perspective is pure, unfiltered, drawn from the subconscious. It reflects its creator, their influences, memories, emotions, habits, and experiences. Conversely, video games are all about interaction between the game makers and the player. Where then is there space for witnessing themselves in the creative process, and how might they recognize and claim it? In the fever of creating gameplay, how does the game maker reflect themselves? Surrealism presents a rich avenue to understand that tension by exposing that interaction between psyches. As Gauss described, surrealist works are the residue left when we have stripped down our souls to the bare framework of the unconscious, which is beneath all ourselves. Thinking about surrealism in video game design thus matters because that understanding moves the creative act beyond the conscious machinations of game mechanics and designing game goals. It enables game designers to consider subconscious expression for and through video games, extending thinking about the role, reflection, and identity of the creator, and widening understanding of the creative act. In understanding the creative act lies also understanding itself, the nature of being human. To tap into the subconscious, the original surrealists used automatism in their visual art and writing, recording the first ideas that came to mind. As opposed to a fastidious director of a composition, the surrealist artist's goal was to become a conduit for whatever may flow from their psyche, and to lose as little in transmission as possible. This immediacy was key to the surrealist's craft. Game development, however, is not spontaneous. Rather, it's a combination of rigorous planning and measured decision-making, and with good reason. Several disparate components must combine to create a video game. A stray polygon here or a misplaced function there, and it begins to come apart at the seams. To integrate automatism into the game development process without compromising its technical foundation, we first outlined a typical procedure for short-form projects. Two distinct phases became apparent: thinking and making. The thinking phase was about defining project goals and laying out a plan to reach them, critically considering what's being made and why. Given its emphasis on cognition, we felt this phase was a good place to start incorporating automatism. But how to define goals and cognate a plan without thinking? Our solution was to first employ free association to draft 3 mind maps. Each map explored a central tenet of surrealist philosophy, which we identified through a review of literature discussing the original movement. We highlighted 3 recurring themes: a fascination with dreams in the subconscious, a nonconformist disposition, and an idealization of the irrational. We used the mind maps as a warm-up exercise to spontaneously generate ideas about the shape and form of the game. Importantly, the mind mapping exposed the different degrees of cogency of our thoughts. Certain items had clearer applicability to game design than others. For example, unnatural borders, impossible scale, and an eerily familiar locations all suggest certain styles of world design. However, other thoughts, like incongruous 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿𝗰𝘁 and why wouldn't Spider-Man just tie him up, seemed less relevant to the game development work. Immediately following the free association mind mapping exercise, we drafted a stream of consciousness paragraph to collect our thoughts into a single guiding document. This paragraph would serve as our game's design document. Through the use of automatic techniques in this thinking phase, we were able to produce a set of project goals with minimal consideration as to how we would achieve them. It was an effective method for stirring up ideas for the game and required less meticulous oversight as compared to an iterative design approach. Without a logical plan in place, without an obvious task hierarchy, the making phase opened up, ripe with opportunity for spontaneous implementations. We could develop components of the game as and when they came to mind. We then started the making process. Wary of thoughts that might attempt to rationalize the project goals, we set out to think about the project only when we were at the computer, ready to implement. We began development in the Unity engine with a simple character control script, just a few lines of code to get things moving. During our development, we answered questions of content as quickly as we could. In an attempt to tap into the subconscious, intuition rules above all. How should the player move? Roll, we answer, only stopping to consider our inclination after the work is done. Whim following was a consistent theme throughout development. The morning after we implemented the basic character controls, we recorded sounds, most of them within the hour. We did not prepare a list of required sounds. It was simply a process of discovery, of the noises around us and of our bodies as we went about our mornings. A process of discovering the soundscape of the game to come. We avoided all questions of suitability. Why should this character look this way? Is this environment right for the game? Should we be recording sounds at this stage? We refused to answer all these questions. In pursuit of an answer, rationalization could creep in. We modeled the player character, Arter, shortly after recording the sounds. No sketches were made and no personality was considered. Rather than through vertex modeling or sculpting, we formed Arter from Blender's metaballs. As metaballs were shifted around the 3D viewport, Arter gradually took shape. After completing the player character, we started development on Lucid Assemblage's environments. Conventional game design would follow an iterative approach, involving sketching level layouts and grayboxing areas. As you might guess, we took a less measured approach for our game. We began with the cube upon which Arter was created, and expanded outward. The world of Lucid Assemblage does not allude to any greater context for its terrain. Instead, the game's spaces exist as they were conceived, as stray thoughts that popped into our minds. At some point during the creation of the game's first area, we envisioned a herd of Arters moving together. Without any further consideration, we used that thought to spawn the game's second area, a strip of land where Arters flock. Other areas came about while we were away from the computer. Stepping away from the computer doesn't necessarily stop the flow of new ideas. These kinds of thoughts presented a challenge, as every second away from the keyboard was a second for the thought to be rationalized. As a countermeasure, we simply jotted down these ideas as they occurred, ideally only to be considered when they could be implemented. When we reached dead ends, we turned to our stream of consciousness paragraph to stoke creativity. For example, in the initial brainstorm, we wrote, posterized photos of real-world objects and human hands. So we collected these photos, some while working on the game, others in the midst of daily life. We then used these photos, most of them heavily distorted by Photoshop, to populate the fourth area of the game. Having created Lucid Assemblage, these photos carry memories, ghosts of lived experience. As a player, they may feel familiar yet unknown. Finally, we added the unbothered non-player characters. Consistent in inconsistency, we did not form a plan to create the game's cast. As the game's areas were built, we mentally marked certain spaces to be occupied by an NPC, though not all of these were ultimately filled. For NPCs that did end up in the game, we created them through various techniques. Some were shaped from the same metaballs that formed Arter, others with vertex modeling. Some were animated with a low frame rate appearance, others through shape keys, and others not at all. We finally wrapped up development with the bookends of the gameplay experience, the title screen and end state. These were deliberate inclusions, to meet the standards expected of a video game. Here's the result of our automatic game development process. In Lucid Assemblage, the player controls the avatar Ardor, who may roll, levitate, and shatter at will. Ardor inhabits 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗁, an expansive void occupied by disparate yet vaguely connected locations. The game opens with a line of dialogue from Ardor, who declares they are seeking Amelia. Otherwise, there is no other goal imposed on the player. They may do as they please. Ardor begins in the entire world, a box containing 5 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗁 denizens with whom Ardor may converse. The denizens do not know of or believe in Amelia. As the player explores the entire world, they may notice cracks in the enclosure. If they push against the entire world's boundaries, the walls start to come apart. Beyond them, a stark black void. Falling into the void, the player will eventually land on the Ardor grazing plane, a stretch of land where beings that resemble the player character reside. As the player crosses the plane, these beings will appear, gravitating towards the player character. They are relentless, and may push the player off course. If the player outpaces them, they will burst from exertion in their struggle to keep up. At the far end of the Ardor grazing plane is a hole in the void, leading to a vast expanse of homeware displays. This area, the furniture garden, is labyrinthine, with a single exit and little to indicate direction. In the furniture garden, the player may encounter curious arrangements of furniture, flipped hallways, and another denizen. They too dissuade Ardor from seeking Amelia. Should the player find a gap in the garden, it will fall down the dream hole. The dream hole is winding, home to apparitions that watch Ardor as they pass through. At the end of the dream hole is Pillar Pit, with a winding structure called Station Pillar at its center. Station Pillar is never wholly visible, making it a treacherous climb. Atop Station Pillar is the Homestead, a sketch of a house upon a cardboard frame. The front door is open. Within that frame is the impression of a slightly misshapen home, rendered in fuzzy detail. Upstairs is a counter through a doorway, too narrow for anyone to fit through. Next to it is a bedroom, with empty shelves and blank monitors. If the player moves towards what would be windows, they may discover a denizen hiding in the black. This denizen, when approached, will morph into a table. Down the hallway is a cavernous room, far too large to fit within the house the player entered. Crumbling pillars hold up nothing, and a fragmented staircase floats motionless in the air. There is an opening near the top of the room. Moving through it, the player arrives in a field, still surrounded by the void. Just above the hill in the center, a light that might be Amelia fluctuates. Ardor is pulled towards the light. When Ardor makes contact, they burst apart. Although they have shattered, they make one final declaration: they will never give up the search. What did we learn about automatic game development from making Lucid Assemblage? The first lesson was understanding where and how rational thinking takes place in the game development process. The complexity of games exacerbates the tension between the conscious and subconscious during development. Our use of automatic techniques allowed forethought to be minimized throughout development, preventing rationalization. To a certain degree, this was successful. For example, our free association and stream of consciousness writing at the beginning of development effectively set project goals without planning. However, in game development, the unalloyed application of automatism was insufficient in defending against rationalization. Game development is an evolved practice. It is an assembly of traditions in visual art, writing, computer science, music, and more. It is also a technical practice. Lines of code must be rational. Performance issues must be optimized. Visual bugs must be diagnosed logically. Throttled by the game engine's capacity to compile, certain technical standards must be met to create a playable whole. The incorporation of automatic techniques into game development presents a contradiction. To create automatically, one must try not to think, to allow one's subconscious to shine through. To create a video game, one must think, to allow the computer to interpret their intentions. This balancing act between minimizing forethought while exercising a degree of reason also echoes the contradiction at the heart of Surrealism, or, as we've put it in our project title, the endeavor of thinking about how not to think. But that endeavor is not futile. Rather, Surrealist game making demands one to think carefully about where not to think. Where in the process is the space for spontaneous inspiration, for instinctive moves, for impulse? Where is the need for logical thinking, for iterative craft? Understanding the roles and spaces for all the different thought and creative processes would enable combinations for a more fruitful outcome. The second lesson was that automatism, already challenging in its own ways, is not sustainable over long durations. Games take a long time to produce, and that lengthy gestation period between idea and implementation became an unexpectedly major obstacle to automatic game development. Each passing day presented more opportunity for unimplemented ideas from the stream of consciousness paragraph to be considered. And they were considered. We tried to answer questions of content quickly, but at times mulled them over. We avoided asking questions of suitability, but doubts creeped in nonetheless. These were rational habits and hard to break. Moreover, as production continues, new ideas spring forth. This spontaneity was desirable when we could implement ideas straight away, but posed an issue while we were away from the computer. Because ideas like these were dangerous, exciting the mind with creative possibilities. Desperate not to forget them, we would repeat these ideas in our heads. With each repetition, they made more sense. To avoid that cognitive repetition, we recorded these spontaneous ideas in a list, preserved for later implementation. Several components of Lucid Assemblage originated this way, including lines of dialogue, aesthetic features, and areas like the furniture garden. However, while the list enabled us to incorporate new spontaneous thoughts into the game, it also increased the project's scope, complexity of implementation, and, accordingly, the time required to complete it. Automatism thus causes its own undoing. Its perpetuity of spontaneity renders the project impossible. Its unbridled freedom kills the work. As tempting as it was to chase fresh ideas, a full process of automatism might have extended the project indefinitely. It would never be finished. Without being finished, it is not a game. Freedom must be curtailed, not for craft nor technical reasons, but because that is the nature of the creative act. To be is not only to be created, but to be ended. In this project, we made a surreal video game, and thought through the process of designing a video game with surrealist principles of automatism and use of the subconscious. The limitations of automatic game development make clear that there is still room for surrealist game design approaches to be explored. Further studies might experiment with the parameters of the automatic game development framework. For example, Lucid Assemblage used the identified tenets of Surrealism as themes during the free association exercise. But it's uncertain if different themes would have produced a similarly surreal result. Alternatively, automatic game development could be attempted without defining project goals in a dedicated thinking phase, or other surrealist techniques, like the juxtaposition of disparate elements, could be considered. The recent surge in surreal video games presents a great opportunity to go beyond surreal stylings, and instead consider alternative game development methods. These methods are not only for creating new interactions between game and player, but between psyches.